Hello everyone, my name is Nathan, also known as the Journeyman Philosopher, and I'd like to welcome you to the latest video in the Fireside Chat Series. I wanted to talk about something today that is a question that has really challenged the very best of humanity for as long as we have been able to think for ourselves and write things down, and basically since the very earliest stages of what we would call civilization. And that is motives. Now, this really does tie into the question of what is right and what is wrong, what is good and what is evil. And that, I think, is the question that has really caused a lot of the greatest minds that humanity has ever produced to struggle to come up with a definitive answer. And I'm not entirely sure that there is one until you start to look at the idea of motivation. Now, to me, motivation is everything. Motivation determines whether something is good or bad, although I'm not a huge fan of those terms in general. I remember reading something many years ago where one of the creators of the tabletop game Dungeons and Dragons was talking about one of the mechanisms that they created for the game was what they called an alignment chart. And this had two axes, one of which was good, neutral and evil, and the other one was lawful, neutral and chaotic. Now, you applied two of those together, and that would give your character a particular alignment, which would kind of give you an idea of how that character was supposed to react in any given circumstance. So lawful good, for example, is someone who would follow the law no matter what, would trust that the law was there to protect people and to do the right thing, and so would fight to uphold those laws. Chaotic good, on the other hand, was someone who had no particular time for laws, who was still an inherently good person and who would try and do the best that they could, but if what they determined was the right thing to do was against the law, then they would do that too. It was a really interesting system, and I remember that one of the creators being asked, how do you define good and evil? Because it was such an interesting question when all these people were coming across this, how do we actually classify these characters that we've created? And he answered really simply. He said, good is selfless, evil is selfish. And so basically what he meant by that was someone who is, to stick with the alignment chart because I feel like it's a useful tool for this, because it really does apply in many ways to the real world too. Someone who is lawful good would follow the law because they believe it's the best for society, even if it disadvantaged themselves. They would assume that the law had been created with the benefit of everyone in mind, and so it should be followed because that's the best thing for society. Now, someone who was lawful evil would also follow the law, but they would do so in such a way that was selfish. They would follow the law in order to gain benefit for themselves. So the sorts of people who take advantage of tax laws, for example, using loopholes in the law in order to advance their own cause, to get more money for themselves rather than paying their own fair due. That, for example, would be a lawful evil act, as opposed to someone who is chaotic evil, who would just do whatever they wanted whenever they wanted to do it. That would be completely selfish. So how does this actually tie into motives? Well, this, I believe, it's the best summary in a really shorthand form that I've ever seen of what it is to be good and evil, if those terms can ever really be said to exist. Someone who is good functions out of the motivation of selflessness, of the greater good, the good of the whole, the good of the many. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. That sort of mentality and that sort of approach to life. Whereas someone who is evil is much more interested in their own selfish gain. They're the ones that will do whatever they need to do in order to get ahead. They might help people on occasion, but it will only ever be if it benefits them. That very sort of mercenary approach to life. And so these motives, these really simple, basic motives, selfishness versus selflessness, to me are the best way of determining what is right and wrong. Again, as far as those terms can be said to exist, I'm very aware that the very concept of right and wrong is inherently flawed because everybody is going to have a different idea about what it actually is. So it kind of begins to lose a lot of meaning when you could walk up to 20 different people on the street and you get 20 very different answers about what good and bad actually is. But insofar as they can be applied to anything, good is about selflessness. Good is about the great of the whole. It's about the collective good. It's about making sure that everybody has enough, that everybody has what they need, that everybody is being looked after. Whereas the bad or the evil side of things is much more that dog eat dog, every man for themselves kind of approach, where you end up with everyone scrambling all over each other to try and get to the top of the pile, and nobody is particularly concerned about who they step on to get there. Now you start to see perhaps some of the problems with modern society when you realise that we are very much of the latter as a race, as a whole. Not all individuals, certainly not. There are plenty of good people out there in the world. But if you look at humanity as a whole, the only conclusion that you can draw is that humanity is actually evil. Because the vast majority of humanity is much more driven by the need to be selfish than the need to be selfless. It is a very rare person that you would find, not unheard of, certainly not unheard of. I'm not saying this applies to everyone. There are certainly very genuinely kind-hearted, good people in the world. I wish there were more of them sometimes, but they do certainly exist. They are there. But certainly my experience at least, and everyone has their own experience of this, but this has certainly been my experience, is that most people function from a selfish place. Most people are interested in what they can get out of something rather than what they can give back. There's that very famous saying that came out of World War II America: ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And in time of war, that certainly made sense. There was a lot of generosity. There was a lot of people giving up of themselves in order to do the right thing. It does make me wonder a little if that same situation arose today. Would we as a people in the place that we are at now be able to do the same thing that our forefathers did in World War II? That our ancestors managed to accomplish, where they gave up of themselves wholesale in order to do the right thing, in order to protect others. But that's neither here nor there. The point of this is that it does come down to that very simple question. What is it that motivates us? Are we motivated from a place of selflessness, where everything that we do, or at least attempt to do, because it's not so simple as cut and dried, everything works every time, but are we motivated from that place where we're at least attempting to do the right thing by other people? Or are we motivated from that selfish place where it becomes all about us, where we're not interested in what anybody else is taking out of what we're doing, or if we take something that someone else desperately needs, We're interested in what we can get out of it. We're interested in how we can get ahead, how we can further our own cause in that mad scramble to the top of the pile, to be the one who is receiving the most and never missing out. I saw something really interesting a few months ago where someone was talking about shopping trolleys. And it was a really simple idea. They actually said that the shopping trolley is the single most accurate measure of someone's character. It seems like such a ridiculous thing to say, but hear me out. Basically, what this person was saying is that there is no social or moral obligation to put your trolley away after you've been to the supermarket. There's no penalty for not doing so. There's no punishment that applies. The worst you might get is a bit of a frown from other people if you dump your trolley somewhere, if you leave it in the middle of the parking lot or wherever. There's no particular downside to doing it. And yet to do so is incredibly selfish, because A, you're leaving a trolley somewhere where somebody else can't use it, and B, you're potentially leaving it in somebody else's way, especially if you leave it in the car park itself. So even though it's a very small act, it is quite a selfish one. The selfless act is to go and return your trolley, to put it back in the trolley return bay. And it's these small little measures I find that most accurately reflect how we really are as a person. Are we actually willing to put ourselves out a little bit in order to do the right thing? Even if there's no reward for it, even if there's no punishment for doing the wrong thing, do we always endeavour to do the right thing, even when it doesn't really matter that much? There's a saying from an English philosopher from the 17th century: the true measure of a man is what he would do if he knew he would never be found out. And to me, that really epitomises this whole question. Because ultimately, what we do when somebody is watching still counts. It's not a bad thing to be, a good person all of the time. Obviously, that would be the ideal that we would strive towards. At least most of us, I assume, would strive to be a good person, although, granted, there are a lot of people who choose not to be, so maybe not. What we do when somebody is watching, I find, is so much less important than what we do when there is nobody to observe. When we could do anything and we could get away with it. There would be no consequences. We could steal, we could lie, we could cheat, and nobody would ever know. In those moments, what do we choose to do? Do we choose to do the right thing? And when I say the right thing, I mean, do we choose to do the selfless thing? Do we choose to do the thing that is of the highest good for the most people? Not necessarily for all people, because that's not necessarily possible. Sometimes doing the right thing by 1,000 people means doing the wrong thing by 10. That is very true. It's not always so cut and dried as to be a perfect scenario. In fact, it almost never is. But even if, for example, those 10 people that would be inconvenienced to put out by something that would be the right thing by 1,000 people, that's an easy thing to do when everyone is a stranger. If you've got 1,000 strangers and 10 strangers, I think most of us would probably make the choice to do the right thing by 1,000 people if we didn't know anybody that was involved. If one of the 10, though, becomes a family member, someone we love, someone we care about, that becomes a more difficult question. Would we do the right thing by 1,000 strangers, or would we do the right thing by 10 people that we know? When doing the right thing by 10 people that we know would be doing the wrong thing by 1,000 people, or vice versa. It becomes a more interesting question then. Because most of us are hardwired to look after ourselves, to look after the people that we love and care about. These animal bodies that we inhabit are selfish inherently. They have to be. Because everything is about survival. On a purely human level, on this purely physical level, everything is about survival. You have to make sure that you have enough food, you have to make sure that you have shelter, you have to make sure that you're warm enough or cool enough if it's too hot. You have to make sure that you have everything to survive. And in the wild, that often means somebody else is going to miss out if you take what you need. So in a very real way, this very basic human level stuff is conditioned to be selfish, as all animals are. You know, it's very common to see animals that will eat past the time that they're full. Fish, in fact, are notorious for this. They will eat well past the time that they're full simply because there is food in front of them and they need it, and they don't know when they'll be able to eat again. So they continue to eat, sometimes actually to the point of actually killing themselves from overeating. But that's a whole nother thing. But the point is, to me, that sort of behaviour in a human being, in one of us, is not particularly brilliant. That's not the sort of thing that I want to see out of humanity. I want to see higher reasoning. I want to see a much more measured approach to life and to everything in the universe. I want to see people who take a considered approach. Do I actually need this thing? Would it be better in somebody else's hands? Am I the best person to be dealing with this? Whatever the question may be, whatever the situation may look like, taking into account the fact that we are not really ever alone. We are all in this together. Humanity as a whole has only made the progress that it's made, whether you look at socially, technically, philosophically. Any of the progress that we have made is always built upon the backs of those who came before us. We are a collective. The only reason that we have all this amazing technology we have today is because 6,000 years ago someone started carving into a stone. Or, 300 years ago somebody invented the steam engine. And everyone built on top of that. Everyone that's come after has added more value to what has come before. And we keep progressing, and we come up with all of these amazing things. Socially is exactly the same. Society continues to evolve based on what came before. We learn from the mistakes, in an ideal world at least, we learn from the mistakes and we build upon the successes. Sometimes we go backwards, that's okay too. It's all a matter of collective choice. Some of the choices that we make come from a very selfish place, where you have individuals who have been traumatized, who have been hurt by the system, by society, by people, and they want, rather than to make things better for everyone, they want revenge. And they go out and they set about trying to change things from a place of revenge. That's a selfish motivation. So the change that comes out of that is not likely to be particularly brilliant. It's not likely to be very enlightened. It's much more likely to drag us backwards than it is to bring us forwards. And unfortunately, that happens quite a bit in modern society. A lot of people are hurt. And as the saying goes, hurt people hurt people. When you have hurt people lashing out at each other, at society, at individuals, we as a whole get dragged backwards through that. Whereas when you look at all of the amazing progress and changes that have occurred over the course of human history, they've all come from a place of selflessness. They have all come from that place of, this is the collective good. This is what is best for everyone. Yes, it might be very good for me too. I'm not saying there's never going to be any selfishness in doing the right thing, just as there's not necessarily going to be a lack of selflessness in doing the wrong thing. They are very much sliding scales. They're not absolute one way or the other. But the driving force tends to be one thing or another. It tends to be about what is good for the whole or what is good for the self. Sometimes those two things align, sometimes they're completely diametrically opposed. Obviously, when they align, things become a lot easier than when they are opposed. But ultimately, when you boil everything down to it, it still just comes back to that simple question. What is the motivation behind whatever it is that you're doing? Is it primarily selfless, or is it primarily selfish? That, to me, really helps us to define what is right and wrong, good and evil, however it is that you want to term it. If most of what you are doing through the course of your life comes from a selfless place, where you are doing your best to do right by everyone else, you put your trolley back when you don't necessarily need to, then to me that makes someone a good person. If you go through life driven entirely by selfish motives, and you are quite happy to step on other people in order to get ahead, where you are willing to take from somebody else who needs in order to have for yourself, well, to me that makes you a bad or an evil person. As much as those words even really mean anything, I don't really believe that they do, because I don't believe anybody is truly so one-dimensional. Everybody has moments of both, I believe. We all have enormous capacity for selfishness and selflessness. It's simply a matter of what we choose to do in each given moment. It's not about being an absolute, one or the other. We all have the potential for both. It's simply a matter of which we choose. Anyway, that's all from me for today. Hopefully you enjoyed this little exploration of motivation, and hopefully there was something useful in there for you. Until next time, take care and goodbye.